Dallas police officer Amber Geiger shot and killed her unarmed neighbor Botham Shem Jin inside his home.
Late on the evening of September 6, 2018, the quiet Southside Flats apartment complex located in South Dallas, Texas, was in the national spotlight. Local residents, accustomed to peaceful living in modern apartments, were alarmed by the sounds of gunshots. In one of the apartments on the fourth floor, 26-year-old Botham Shem Jin was shot dead. The victim was a young accountant, a native of St. Lucia, who had moved to Dallas for a job and better prospects. But what shocked the public more was the identity of the shooter. She turned out to be Dallas police officer Amber Geiger, who was off duty at the time of the murder. The incident instantly became the object of public attention, not only because of the fact of the murder, but also because of the strange circumstances of the incident. Geiger claimed that she had shot Botham by mistake. She claimed that she had mistaken his apartment for her own and thought that a stranger had entered her dwelling. Geiger's version of events raised a wave of questions, particularly because of the apparent inconsistencies and a number of suspicious details that began to surface during the investigation. The case grew into a high-profile trial in a short period of time, attracting the attention of human rights activists, politicians, and ordinary citizens. For many, the case has come to symbolize deep-rooted problems in the law and order system and the use of force by the police. The Southside Flats apartment complex was located at the intersection of several streets in one of Dallas's growing neighborhoods. The complex was modern and popular with young professionals, providing tenants with all the amenities for a comfortable life. Spacious apartments, secure parking, a pool and gym attracted those looking for a tranquil setting near downtown. On the evening of September 6, 2018, Botham Shem Jin was at home as usual. His apartment was located on the fourth floor of the complex. He had just returned from work, ordered a meal, and was relaxing after a day's work, probably going about his daily routine. At that minute, he could not have anticipated that a deadly threat would suddenly burst into his peaceful life.
But she doesn't go to her unit on the third floor. Instead, she ends up on the fourth floor.
Amber Geiger, a patrol officer with the Dallas Police Department, had finished her shift and was on her way home to the same high-rise apartment building. Her apartment was one floor below, on the third floor. As she climbed the stairs, she got the wrong floor and ended up at the door of Botham's apartment. As Geiger herself later claimed, she did not notice that she was on the wrong floor and felt threatened when she saw the door half open. Geiger decided that someone had broken into her apartment. Without delay, she drew her service weapon. When she opened the door, she saw a man inside the apartment. At that moment, as she stated in interviews, she thought it was a burglar breaking into her home. In fear and panic, before she could properly assess the situation, she fired twice at the man on the sofa. Botham Shem Jin sustained fatal injuries from which he died shortly afterwards.
When she walks up to the front door, there's a red doormat that is not her own. That should have been a signal.
The crime scene was a spacious apartment with a modern interior that had no visible signs of forced entry or struggle. When detectives arrived on scene and began their examination, they immediately noted several key details. The first thing that caught the investigators' attention was the presence of distinctive signs in the hallway and around the apartment that could have pointed Geiger to her mistake. For example, the mat in front of Botham's door was different from the one in front of her own apartment. This fact raised questions. How could an experienced police officer have failed to notice these obvious differences? Inside the apartment, there were no signs of a struggle. There were items on the couch that indicated that Jean was having a quiet evening: an open pizza box, a drink on the table, and a television on. Judging by the position of the body and the nature of the wounds, it could be assumed that Botham had not expected the attack and had not even had time to react in any way to the intrusion. The main physical evidence was a service model Glock pistol, which fired 2 shots. Both hits were fatal. One bullet entered the chest, the second one hit vital organs. A forensic medical examination showed that Jin died minutes after being wounded. Investigators also noticed another strange circumstance. Geiger claimed that the door to Botham's apartment was ajar and that this was one of the reasons why she felt threatened. However, forensics showed that the doors at the Southside Flats apartment complex were equipped with special automatic locks that automatically locked when closed. This raised doubts that the door could have been simply unlocked or ajar, as Geiger said. It added a new link to the chain of suspicion regarding her words.
You saw someone?
Yes, I thought it was my apartment. I'm Oh my God. I'm sorry.
After Geiger fired the fatal shots, she immediately called 911. In recorded conversations with the dispatcher, her confusion and anxiety could be heard. "I thought it was my apartment. I thought it was my apartment," she repeated, trying to explain the situation. Botham Shem Jin was born on September 29, 1991 on the Caribbean island of St. Lucia to Allison and Bertram Jin. He grew up in a family with strong religious traditions, which made a noticeable imprint on his personality and outlook. Botam, from childhood, was brought up in an atmosphere of strict discipline and moral principles. This led to his sincere interest in the Christian faith and active participation in the life of the church, to which he devoted much of his life. As he grew older, Botham began to stand out among his peers for his pursuit of personal growth and education. He attended Harding University in Arkansas, where he earned a bachelor's degree in accounting and business. This education exposed him to many career opportunities, including a job in Dallas, Texas, where he held the prestigious position of associate auditor with PricewaterhouseCoopers. Those around him described Botham as a man of outstanding charisma and kindness. He was known for his smile and friendliness, his openness and desire to help others. One of his main passions was music. In particular, he sang in the church choir and took an active part in the religious life of the local community. Those close to him emphasized his deep religiosity, kind-heartedness, and willingness to support others. Amber Geiger was born on August 9, 1988, in Texas. Her childhood and adolescence were spent in the working-class neighborhood of Dallas, where she developed an interest in law enforcement from an early age. Her loved ones noted that Amber dreamed of becoming seprish. Akasa furious urager shanser, rambichanokamisum, childhood, and always talked about the desire to protect law and order. Geiger's police career began in 2013 when she joined the Dallas Police Department. After being promoted to patrol officer, she quickly established herself as an executive and disciplined officer. Over the next several years, Geiger gained experience in various positions, participating in arrests, responding to calls, and taking part in patrolling the city. Colleagues characterized her as calm and determined, someone who was not afraid of challenges and confident in performing her duties. Despite praise for her professionalism, a number of officers also noted her sometimes excessive rigidity and lack of flexibility in dealing with suspects. Prior to the tragic events of September 6, 2018, Geiger had not been involved in any serious incidents involving excessive use of force or discipline. However, one incident in 2017 caught the attention of investigators during the Botam Shem Jin murder investigation. In that case, Geiger also fired a shot at a suspect during an arrest, wounding a man who was later found to be unarmed. The event caused temporary concern among her colleagues, but an investigation found the officer's actions were lawful in self-defense. At the time of the Botham Shem Jin incident, Amber Geiger had already been a police officer for 5 years. She was part of a special patrol that responded to serious incidents in central Dallas. At the time of the tragedy, Geiger was off duty, returning home after a long day of work and, she said, was fatigued and stressed. It was this, she later claimed, that led to the tragic mistake. Amber Geiger's psychological state at the time of the crime was a key aspect of the investigation. She claimed to be in a state of extreme fatigue and stress after a long day at work, which led to her mistake. Investigators began looking at her work schedule and analyzing her physical and emotional state that day. Geiger's work shift was indeed stressful, but her fatigue could not be an excuse for such a serious error. It was important to find out whether her decision to use a weapon met the standards of a police officer's professional response. The experts noted that police officers are specially trained to deal with stressful situations, and their training includes the ability to maintain composure even under extremely dangerous conditions. In addition, the state of her psyche and perception at the time of the incident was an important consideration. Forensics confirmed that Geiger had no traces of alcohol or drugs in her system that could have affected her behavior. However, fatigue may have actually impaired her ability to think rationally, which she said led to her actions. After the crime was committed, Geiger called 911 and attempted to administer first aid to Botham Shem Jin until paramedics arrived. However, her attempts were unable to save his life. During further questioning and at trial, her testimony remained relatively consistent, but additional questions arose as to why she did not use less lethal methods of restraining the suspect, such as ordering him to stop or using a stun gun.
Okay, we have help on the way.
I know, but I'm gonna lose my job. I thought it was my apartment.
Investigators also paid attention to Geiger's behavior in the first minutes after the incident. Signs of panic were audible in her 911 call, but she also repeated several times that she was in trouble and could lose her job, which drew criticism. Those statements raised doubts that her top priority was saving the victim's life rather than looking out for her own career. The investigation into the murder of Botham Shem Jin began immediately after Amber Geiger reported the incident to 911. Dallas police officers, paramedics, and investigators arrived on the scene. Geiger was taken into custody immediately after the call, but at first she was not considered a criminal. Her coworkers initially assumed it was a tragic case of mistaken identity. However, further investigation and analysis of the circumstances began to reveal troubling inconsistencies in her testimony.
While the responding officers desperately tried but ultimately couldn't save Jean's life, the audio and video at the time,
Police officers who arrived on the scene quickly became convinced that the situation was far from as simple as it might have appeared at first glance. No signs of forced entry or struggle were found in Botham's apartment. This effectively ruled out the theory that Botham could have somehow instigated the attack or resisted, as Geiger had originally claimed. Geiger was detained for further questioning, but she was released on bail a few days later, which sparked a wave of criticism from the public. People who disagreed with this approach demanded immediate arrest and a tougher approach to the investigation. The investigation, meanwhile, continued to gather evidence, building a complete picture of what happened that fateful night. Ballistic examination confirmed that both shots were fired at close range and aimed at vital organs. Forensic experts concluded that the victim had no possibility of surviving such wounds. Autopsy results also showed that Botham was sober at the time of his death and had not taken any illegal substances. A psychological evaluation of Geiger's condition at the time of the incident confirmed that she was under extreme stress and fatigue, which could have affected her ability to adequately assess the situation. However, this did not negate the fact that her actions did not meet the standards of a police response to a threat. Moreover, her decision to immediately use a firearm, rather than attempting to establish contact or use less lethal means, drew criticism from experts. After completing the initial phase of the investigation, Dallas investigators decided to file formal charges against Amber Geiger. She was initially arrested on suspicion of manslaughter. However, under public pressure and in light of the evidence obtained during the investigation, the charges were reclassified to second-degree murder. This was an important turning point in the case. The decision to file more serious charges demonstrated that the investigation had found sufficient evidence to believe that Geiger's actions were willful, or at least in gross violation of permissible standards for the use of force.
Not only that, but entering into the apartment, it very much looked like any other bachelor's apartment, or what you would expect in a bachelor's apartment to look like.
The prosecutor's office stated that Amber Geiger, as a police officer with years of experience, should have acted differently, even assuming she did mix up the apartment. The need to prove her intent to kill Botham Jin was not before the prosecution, but the key was to prove that her actions were excessive and not appropriate to the situation.
And ultimately charged with murder.
The trial began on September 23, 2019 in Dallas County District Court. The sessions attracted widespread public attention because the Amber Geiger case involved not only the murder of an innocent man, but also critical questions about the use of force by law enforcement officers. It has come to symbolize the national debate about racial injustice, particularly in the context of confrontations between African American people and police officers. At sessions, the prosecution focused on the fact that Amber Geiger should have taken steps to de-escalate the situation when she confronted the man in the apartment. Prosecutors presented evidence that showed Geiger did not use less lethal response techniques, such as yelling, ordering the man to stop, or tasering him that could have saved Botham's life. According to the prosecution, her actions were in the nature of unreasonable aggression. The defense, in turn, tried to prove that Geiger acted in a state of shock and fear for her life. They presented her as a person who made an honest mistake, being in a state of extreme fatigue after a hard day's work. In their version, Geiger mistook Botham for an intruder, and her reaction was motivated by fear for her own safety. The lawyers emphasized that she did not act out of malice, but out of an instinct for self-preservation that failed her at the time. An important aspect of the trial was the testimony of witnesses. Key witnesses included neighbors who heard gunshots and screams immediately after the incident. One key witness, a neighbor of Botham's, claimed to have heard a woman's voice yelling, get away," just before the shots were fired. This testimony played into the defense's hands, as it could support Geiger's version that she was trying to warn Botham before opening fire. However, prosecutors questioned the accuracy of this testimony, arguing that such a scream could have been caused by her realization of what she had done after the shots were fired. Other witnesses, such as experts on police practices, argued that Geiger did not follow proper protocols for police officers. Specifically, they pointed out that her reaction was too aggressive for a situation that could have been resolved peacefully. Evidence about Geiger's character and her actions on the job also played an important role. Details of her past firearms incident surfaced at the trial, adding to doubts about her ability to act in cold blood in critical situations. One of the most emotional moments of the trial was when Botham Shem Jin's mother, Allison Jin, spoke. She spoke about what her son was like, an educated, kind, and peaceful person who never clashed with others. "I didn't just lose a son, I lost someone who was a light in our family," she said through tears.
We, the jury, unanimously find the defendant, Amber Geiger, guilty of murder as charged in the indictment.
On October 1st, 2019, the 12-member jury reached their verdict. They found Amber Geiger guilty of murder. This decision caused mixed reactions in the community. On the one hand, supporters of the Botham family considered it an important step toward justice. On the other hand, Geiger's defenders argued that the jury did not take into account all the circumstances of the incident.
Punishment at 10 years imprisonment in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice.
The next stage of the trial was sentencing. In the end, the judge sentenced Geiger to 10 years in prison. This sentence was much lighter than expected by many of the prosecution's supporters, who felt that Geiger deserved a longer sentence for his actions. For others, however, the sentence was a recognition that a police officer, even off-duty, must be held accountable for his actions, especially when they result in the loss of a human life. At the sentencing, a touching moment occurred that became widely known and discussed in the media. Botham's brother, Brant Jean, spoke in front of the court and addressed Amber Geiger. Instead of expressing anger or disappointment, he offered her forgiveness. I forgive you. I don't want you to end up in jail. I only wish you well, he said, then asked the judge to let him hug Geiger. The moment, which stirred emotions in the courtroom, was a symbol of reconciliation and forgiveness, but it also drew criticism from some human rights activists who felt that such forgiveness could send the wrong message that the police could get away with their mistakes. The Amber Geiger case and the murder of Botham Shem Jin caused a powerful backlash in American society and beyond. Reactions to the incident were particularly intense because of a number of factors. It was not just a case of violent death, but a tragedy that sharpened an already existing debate about racial injustice and police use of force in the United States. Botham was a peaceful African-American man shot and killed in his own home by a white policewoman. This combination of facts caused many to associate it with previous cases of law enforcement violence against black citizens. Following the murder, protests began to spring up both in Dallas and other cities. The main demands of protesters centered on the need for a fair investigation and punishment for the perpetrator. These protests were part of a larger wave of discontent among the African American population that grew amidst numerous incidents with police in recent years, such as the cases of Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and other victims of excessive use of force by law enforcement.
Insecurity about being around and or working with Black people.
The Geiger case and the verdict have stirred public debate on the topic of racial justice and police reform. How police officers should respond in similar off-duty situations has been the subject of intense scrutiny. Numerous experts and public figures have proposed revisions to police training and mandatory conflict de-escalation programs. In the aftermath of the verdict, discussions began about the need for reforms in police structures that would make officers more accountable for their actions. There continued to be public calls for the establishment of independent oversight bodies to investigate crimes involving the police. The case also intensified demands for the mandatory wearing of body cameras by police officers, which would allow them to record any of their actions, even off-duty. Protests continued even after the verdict, and Black Lives Matter activists and other human rights groups continued to organize marches and demonstrations. Their main demands were not only for stiffer penalties for police officers involved in the killings, but also for deep reform of the law enforcement system, which they argued needed to undergo radical changes to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The killing of Botham Shem Jin and the Amber Geiger case was a milestone in the struggle for justice in the U.S. justice system. The incident reminded society of the need to reconsider the role of police officers in society and their powers. Many politicians, public figures, and human rights activists have been active in calling for a review of the rules governing the use of force, as well as for greater oversight of the actions of law enforcement officers. In the long term, the Geiger case has influenced further debates around police reform. It has centered on the accountability of police officers for their actions, especially in off-duty situations. The case also became one of the turning points in the African American rights movement and the fight against racial discrimination in law enforcement. One of the main lessons of the case was the recognition of the need for systemic reforms in the police. Against the backdrop of the Geiger case and other similar cases, the public began to demand tighter control over the actions of law enforcement. Specifically, the following proposals were discussed. Training and education. Proposals have emerged to change police training standards, emphasizing de-escalation and dealing with psychological stress. Since many police officers are faced with difficult and stressful situations, it is important that they know how to respond appropriately and not make hasty decisions, as happened in the Geiger case. Use of less lethal means. The case also highlighted the need to review the use of force policy. Police officers are encouraged to make mandatory use of less lethal means, such as stun guns, before they decide to use firearms. Establishment of oversight bodies. In the context of cases of police violence, demands for the establishment of independent oversight bodies that can objectively investigate the use of force have begun to increase. This measure would minimize internal bias in investigations of incidents involving police officers. Judicial reform. The Amber Geiger case has also been a catalyst for discussions of judicial reform. The public has noticed that police officers often receive lighter sentences for crimes than ordinary citizens. Consequently, calls for harsher penalties for law enforcement officers to ensure justice for victims of police aggression began. The case of Amber Geiger and the killing of Botham Shem Jin has become a landmark case for the American justice system, raising numerous questions about police use of force, racial bias, and deficiencies in law enforcement training. Although Geiger was found guilty and received a prison sentence, the case failed to fully dispel doubts about the fairness of the justice system. Critics pointed out that the lenient sentence reflected broader problems between the police and the African American community. The investigation found that Amber Geiger, despite her years of experience as a police officer, displayed serious errors in judgment and action. Her decision to use a firearm in a situation that could have been handled differently proved fatal to Botham Shem Jin. This has led to discussions about the need to review police training in conflict de-escalation, especially in situations where officers are off-duty. In conclusion, the killing of Botham Shem Jin and the subsequent trial against Amber Geiger showed how deep the problems between the police and the African American population in the United States run. The case reminded society that even mistakes can have fatal consequences, and that law enforcement officers must be held fully accountable for their actions, regardless of their intentions or emotions. The lasting effects of the case include increased public scrutiny of police actions and a push for reforms to increase transparency and fairness. The issue of racial injustice raised in this case remains an important part of political and public debate in the United States. Botam Shem Jin's story is not only a tragedy, but also an important lesson for the entire community that calls for profound changes in the law enforcement and justice system.